The night of the exhibition was heavy with the scent of oil paint and polished marble, the gallery alive with murmurs of critics, collectors, and dreamers who had come to witness the unveiling of the city's most promising talents. Ilara Vance stood near the far wall, her hands clasped behind her back, the faintest trace of nervousness in tapping her fingers against her palm. She had worked tirelessly for this night, and her designs displayed not as paintings, but as three-dimensional models that blended art and architecture in ways few dared to attempt. Presenting her work in a space dominated by canvas and sculpture was risky. Still, Ilara had always believed that structures could breathe with the same vitality as any painting, that walls and arches could hold emotion just as deftly as brushstrokes. She was not born into privilege. Every stone she placed, every line she drew came from a relentless determination to carve out a name for herself. That night, however, as spotlights shimmered across glass and steel miniatures, she felt the gap between herself and the glittering crowd of high society. She could not have known that among them was the man who would alter the course of her life with a single decision. Damien Thorne entered late, a tall figure framed by the door's golden light, commanding attention before he uttered a word. He was heir to the Thorne dynasty, a family that had its hands in finance, real estate, and politics. Their name synonymous with power in the city of Atlanta. His dark suit seemed cut from shadow itself, his movements precise, calculated, yet somehow effortless. He had been raised to recognize opportunity and seize control of any room he entered. Yet as his eyes scanned the gallery, it was not a priceless painting nor a famed critic that caught his attention. It was her. He watched Ilara with quiet intensity, noting the way she explained her designs to a small circle of guests. Her voice carried passion and authority, but the spark in her eyes, that flame of unshakable conviction, drew him closer. Dame Isabelle Dubois had grown accustomed to beauty. It was currency in his world. But conviction, true, raw conviction, was rare. And it was dangerous, because it threatened to pull him into something more profound than fascination. Their first words were simple, but each syllable carried weight. Ilara turned as he approached, startled by the sudden quiet that seemed to ripple through those around her when Damien Thorne stood at her side. He introduced himself with a courtesy that was both genuine and disarming. She, wary of men like him, responded with polite restraint, her guard rising instinctively. But Damien was not deterred. He lingered by her models, asked questions with unusual depth, and listened with an attentiveness that unsettled her. It was as though he was peeling back the layers of her mind, and in return, she found herself drawn to a man who carried the burden of power, yet spoke to her as though she were his equal. By the end of the evening, the murmur in the gallery was no longer about the art alone, but about the unlikely pairing of a rising architect and the scion of one of the wealthiest families in the state. Whispers flew like sparks into dry kindling. Ilara ignored them, for when Damien asked her to walk with him under the city's lantern-lit streets, something inside her told her she stood at the threshold of destiny. The following weeks blurred into a storm of clandestine meetings and fervent exchanges. Damien was relentless in his pursuit. He sent her sketches of buildings she inspired, quotes scribbled in his bold handwriting, invitations to dinners in hidden corners of the city where no paparazzi could reach. Ilara resisted at first, wary of stepping into a world she had never belonged to. Yet each time she resolved to step back, he found a way to remind her that their connection was not a passing fancy, but something profound, something consuming. Inevitably, the affair of hearts became a war of families. Eleanor and Arthur Thorne, Damien's parents, quickly noticed his absences, disregarding the carefully chosen events where he was meant to charm heiresses and forge alliances. When they discovered the truth, fury shook the halls of their estate. Eleanor, elegant and icy, confronted her son with words sharp enough to cut steel. Arthur, stern and immovable, declared that a woman of no pedigree would never be welcome as a Thorne. They had already chosen Isabel Montgomery, the daughter of a senator, as Damien's intended match. Isabel was everything the Thorns desired: wealthy, refined, politically advantageous. But Damien, standing taller than he ever had, defied them. "I will not live a life dictated by contracts," he told them, his voice a mixture of defiance and desperation. "I will marry the woman I love, even if it means I stand alone." The words echoed through the estate, a sentence of exile. Arthur stripped him of financial support, and Eleanor turned her face away as though she no longer had a son. Overnight, Damien was cut off, no longer the golden heir, but a man who had wagered everything on love. And still, he did not falter. He found Ilara the next day, his pride stripped, his eyes raw with truth, and he knelt before her in the quiet of her modest apartment. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice breaking as he took her hand, "I have nothing left but my heart, which belongs to you. Will you marry me?" She had never believed in fairy tales, not truly. Yet in that moment, as tears blurred her vision, as her chest tightened with a love that defied reason, she said yes. Her world shifted, and the gravity that had once grounded her now spun around Damien Thorn. The wedding was nothing like the grandiose celebrations of the elite. It was held in a small chapel adorned with wildflowers, attended by a handful of her closest friends and her mother Clara, who cried quietly through the vows. There were no Thorn relatives, gilded chandeliers, or orchestras filling the air with symphonies. Instead, simplicity, honesty, and the weight of promises were exchanged not for power, but for devotion. When Damien slipped the ring onto Ilara's finger, he swore that he would never betray the trust she had given him, that no force in the world could sever their bond. The world outside may have mocked them. The headlines in society columns called it reckless, foolish, a union doomed to crumble under the weight of reality. Humiliated by the scandal, Isabel Montgomery fled abroad in disgrace, her family hurling venom at the Thorns. Eleanor and Arthur, true to their word, never attended, their silence more cutting than any insult. Yet for Ilara, the absence of approval meant little. She looked at Damien, and in his gaze, she saw a universe that belonged only to them. The first months of marriage unfolded like a dream. They moved into a modest home, nothing like the palaces Dame Isabelle Dubois grown up in, but every corner echoed with laughter and plans for the future. Ilara poured herself into her projects, drawing strength from Damien's unwavering support. Damien, stripped of wealth, found freedom in simplicity. He cooked breakfast with clumsy hands, painted their walls with her favorite colors, walked with her in the rain without an umbrella to see her laugh. He was no longer heir to a dynasty, but a man building a life with the woman he loved. At night, when they lay tangled in the quiet darkness, he whispered vows over her skin, promises of forever that seeped into her bones. She believed him with all her heart, for he had chosen her against the world, and that kind of devotion could never falter. Or so she thought. Even as she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, a shadow lingered at the edges of their bliss. For destiny, cruel and inevitable, had already begun weaving threads of betrayal into the fabric of their love. But in those early days, beneath the fragile glow of newfound happiness, Ilara could not see the storm that waited beyond the horizon. For now there was only love, fierce and unyielding, and vows spoken in defiance of all who sought to tear them apart. The seasons shifted with a gentle certainty, carrying Ilara and Damien through the first years of their marriage like a river moving beneath a sky filled with promise. The modest home they shared became a sanctuary of dreams and late-night conversations. Ilara, now 29, carried a radiant glow that no design competition or architectural award could rival. 16 weeks pregnant, she felt her life finally reaching the pinnacle of fulfillment she had long sought. She would run her fingers gently across her growing belly and whisper promises of the world she was building for the child within her. To Ilara, every heartbeat inside her was a symphony, every kick a silent pledge of hope. She devoted her days to a project close to her heart, designing a new children's hospital in Atlanta. She spent hours sketching, modeling, and consulting, determined to create not just a building but a place of healing, light, and resilience. Each blueprint bore her vision and her love for the life she carried, her daughter, who would soon be named Lyra. She dreamed of walking through those hospital halls with Lyra one day, showing her the power of imagination and the courage to transform visions into reality. Once stripped of his inheritance, Dame Isabelle Dubois found footing in smaller business ventures, enough to keep them comfortable without the grandeur of his family's fortune. He wore sacrifices like medals of honor, proof of his devotion to the woman he chose. To Alara, he was the man who defied his empire for her love. Looking into his eyes, she saw the same fire that had ignited the night of their meeting, the same unwavering promise. Yet, beneath that promise, cracks had begun to form, hairline fractures invisible at first but destined to widen. Damien thrived on intensity, the thrill of risk and the surge of conquest. In the early months of their marriage, Alara had been both his risk and his conquest, and he had reveled in the defiance of his family, the scandal of their union. But as time wore on and the simplicity of their life became routine, Damien began to feel the restless itch of dissatisfaction. He loved Alara, loved her in a way that both steadied and terrified him. But he also found himself haunted by the life he had abandoned. Power, influence, and recognition had once been as natural to him as air, and now they were gone. It was during this fragile time that Serafina Hayes entered his orbit. She had started as a personal assistant in one of his ventures, sharp-witted and striking, with a determination that mirrored his own. She moved with the confidence of someone who wanted to conquer the world, and looked at him with eyes that burned not with trust but hunger. Where Alara's love was steady and selfless, Serafina's was dangerous, electric, and forbidden. She offered him the rush of risk he had once lived for, the exhilaration of stepping outside the lines he had drawn for himself. The affair began innocently enough, or so Damien told himself. Late-night meetings that stretched too long, conversations laced with laughter sharper than they should have been, the brush of hands that lingered a fraction too long. Serafina played her role masterfully, appearing supportive and loyal yet constantly pushing the appropriate boundaries. When Damien finally gave in, when lips met in the shadows of his office, it was less a decision than a surrender. The guilt burned him instantly, but so did the intoxication. He lived in two worlds for 6 months, the devoted husband at home and the reckless lover in the office. Alara noticed the subtle shifts. The way Damien's phone vibrated with messages he would hastily silence. The late nights he blamed on clients. The sudden distraction in his eyes when she spoke of their future. She felt a flicker of unease, but she extinguished it quickly, convincing herself that all men under pressure carried such weight. She told herself that her husband had given up everything for her, and love like that could not fracture. When she placed his hand on her belly and felt Lyra's kick, the tenderness in his expression seemed to erase all doubt. Yet doubt is a patient intruder, creeping into the corners of the mind until it cannot be ignored. One quiet evening, Alara found herself staring at the empty side of the bed, listening to the clock tick past midnight, and feeling an unfamiliar chill crawl along her skin. She pressed her hand against her belly, whispering to her child, as if to reassure them that love was enough, that vows could not be broken so easily. Meanwhile, Serafina grew bolder, her ambition extended beyond passion. She wanted a place in Damien's future, a claim to the empire he had forsaken. She envisioned herself not as a shadow but as the woman at his side, and the knowledge of Alara's pregnancy filled her with fury and determination. To her, Alara represented not only an obstacle, but a mirror reflecting everything she could never be. Pure, trusted, cherished. Serafina would not remain in the shadows forever, and she began planting seeds of confrontation, reminding Damien that secrets could not stay buried. Damien's double life became a labyrinth of lies. He rehearsed excuses in his car before walking into the home he shared with Alara, masking guilt with smiles and kisses. But guilt is not so easily hidden, and each embrace carried a tension Alara could not name. When she asked about his late nights, his eyes shifted too quickly, his voice too smooth. She wanted to believe and feel him, because the alternative was a nightmare she could not yet face. Their love story, once a flame that defied the world, now flickers against the winds of deceit. Ilara stood at the height of joy, preparing nurseries painted in soft hues, selecting names with laughter and care, while Damien carried a secret that threatened to unravel everything. The perfect dream they had built stood tall, but shadows stretched at its edges, lengthening with every passing day. And as the months wore on, the shadows deepened. Now certain of her hold on Damien, Serafina began to press harder. She whispered about futures they could build, which did not include Ilara. She spoke of children not yet born, of dynasties reclaimed, of power reignited. Torn between guilt and desire, Damien could not let go of either world, clinging to Ilara's steady love while indulging in Serafina's dangerous fire. But no secret can remain hidden forever. The dream was too perfect, too fragile, and the first cracks had already begun to show. Ilara's radiant and unquestioning happiness was a beacon that only made the darkness more inevitable. Destinies collided in the shadows of passion and betrayal, and the cost of Damien's choices would soon demand payment. The city carried on, oblivious, as the three lives entwined in silence. Ilara dreamed of the child she carried, Damien dreamed of a life he could never have, and Serafina dreamed of victory. None of them yet knew how quickly those dreams would shatter, how swiftly joy could turn to ruin. The perfect dream had been written in fragile glass, and the first tremors of the dawning shadow had already begun to shake its foundation. The rain had fallen all night, drumming softly against the tall windows of Damien's office, masking the tension that simmered within its walls. At the break of dawn, the city still carried a chill, as though nature itself had sensed the storm that was about to break inside the heart of the man who had once promised eternity. Damien sat at his desk, his tie loosened, and the remnants of whiskey were in a crystal glass beside him. His reflection in the darkened window looked like a stranger, haunted eyes, clenched jaw, a man torn in two. Across from him, Serafina Hayes stood rigid, her posture trembling with fear and defiance. Her words, heavy and final, lingered in the silence between them. "I am pregnant, Damien. 4 weeks." The syllables sliced through him like a blade. For a moment he could not breathe. His mind spun backward to the tender laughter of Ilara in their kitchen, to the ultrasound appointment circled on their calendar, to the hand he placed nightly on her swelling stomach, where their daughter grew. 18 weeks. 18 weeks of hope, of plans, of promises. And now Serafina's revelation had turned everything into a cruel paradox. 2 lives forming at once, one within the woman he loved, the other within the woman who had become his most damning mistake. He pushed away from the desk, pacing the room with the restless energy of a man cornered by fate. "This cannot be happening," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "This is impossible." Serafina's expression hardened. She had rehearsed this moment, envisioned his shock, panic, and denial, but she had not come here to be dismissed. She crossed the room, her eyes blazing between desperation and determination. "It is happening, Damien, and you do not get to pretend it isn't. You have 2 weeks, 2 weeks to decide if you will stand with me, or if you will force me to destroy everything by telling Ilara the truth myself." Her voice cracked slightly at the edges, but her resolve remained unshaken. She was no longer content to be the secret, the shadow hidden behind closed doors. She wanted recognition, she wanted power, and most of all, she wanted him. Damien stopped pacing and gripped the edge of the desk as though anchoring himself to reality. The thought of Ilara, radiant and fragile in her pregnancy, finding out this truth made bile rise in his throat. He could already see the betrayal in her eyes, already hear the shattering of the world they had built together. He loved her, God, he loved her more than life, but his weakness had bound him to another fate. "You cannot do this to her," he whispered, almost pleading. "She is carrying my child too. She is my wife." Serafina's lips curled in a bitter smile. "And what am I, Damien? A mistake you hide in the dark. A sin you bury under lies? You think I will let my child be treated as a secret? You think I will allow you to smile at her, at Ilara, while I endure this alone? Number, I will not. Either you choose me, or I will ensure she knows everything." The ultimatum hung heavy in the room, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. Damien sank into his chair, his hands covering his face. In his mind, two futures played out like dueling nightmares. In one, he left Alexy, betraying the vow that had defined his existence, shattering her heart, and destroying the family he had sworn to protect. In the other, Serafina unleashed her truth, and Alexy discovered his betrayal not from his lips, but from the venom of another woman. Either way, he lost. At that very hour, Alexy was walking through the hospital construction site, her helmet tucked under her arm, her voice strong as she directed a team of contractors. Her heart was light, her face flushed with the glow of expectation. When one of the workers congratulated her on the coming baby, she smiled with a pride that filled the air around her. To her, life was unfolding perfectly. The world was hers to build, and she believed, with every fiber of her being, that Damien was her anchor, her partner, her forever. That night, when Damien returned home, he found her sitting by the nursery window, sketchbook open on her lap. She had drawn the crib, the wallpaper, even the small rocking chair she wanted to place beside the window. Her eyes sparkled when she looked up at him, and she held out the drawing as if it were a treasure. "I want her to see the stars when she falls asleep," Alexy said softly. "I want her to believe she was born to shine." Her words pierced through him, guilt rising like a tidal wave. He took the paper from her hands, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "She will, Alexy. She will." His voice trembled, but she did not notice. She leaned against him, content, unaware that the man she trusted most was already crumbling under secrets too heavy to bear. Meanwhile, Serafina grew impatient. Each day her body reminded her of the life inside her, and with every reminder, her resentment deepened. She was not blind to Damien's hesitation, or how he clung desperately to his wife. Her jealousy festered, transforming into a sharp-edged weapon. She began planning what she would say, how she would reveal the truth, the precise moment when Ilara's world would collapse. Damien knew the clock was ticking. 2 weeks felt like 2 breaths, slipping away before he could grasp them. He told himself he would find a way to protect Ilara and shield her from the firestorm, yet every decision led to ruin. He started avoiding Serafina's calls, silencing her messages, hoping that somehow denial would erase reality. But Serafina was relentless. One evening, she appeared outside his building, her voice cold and furious as she warned him that time was nearly gone. "You cannot have both of us," she hissed. "You cannot keep living this lie. Choose her, and you lose me, and your son. Choose me, and you lose her. But you will not stand in the middle forever. I will not allow it." The word son slammed into Damien's chest like a hammer. Though she had no certainty, Serafina's conviction made the possibility real. The thought of a boy, his son, gnawed at him, twisting his conscience into knots. He imagined holding Lyra in one arm and Leo in the other, 2 children of 2 mothers, 2 futures colliding in chaos. It was a curse, a cruel design of fate, and he was its architect. In those restless nights, Damien began to unravel. He sat awake long after Ilara had drifted to sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he could preserve what mattered most while holding together the pieces of a shattering life. His love for Ilara was real, undeniable, but so was the gravity of his mistake. And the longer he remained silent, the closer the storm drew, its thunder echoing in every corner of his mind. Ilara, blissfully unaware, continued to weave dreams around her growing daughter. She prepared tiny clothes, painted lullabies into the walls, and trusted Damien with the innocence of someone who had never imagined betrayal. She saw the fatigue in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, and she mistook it for stress at work. She kissed his hand, pressed it to her belly, and whispered that everything would be all right. But everything was not all right. The curse of 2 lives unborn weighed heavier with each day, pressing down on Damien until he could scarcely stand. He was torn between 2 women, 2 children, and 2 versions of himself, the husband who had defied the world for love, and the man who had betrayed that love in the dark. And as the days of Serafina's ultimatum dwindled to their end, Damien realized there would be no escape, no path that spared them all. The dream Ilara cherished was fragile glass, and soon, someone, whether Serafina, fate, or Damien himself, would shatter it beyond repair. The city bloomed with the lushness of spring, its streets alive with blossoms that painted the air with fleeting sweetness. Yet for Ilara, now entering the 24th week of her pregnancy, life had begun to carry an unsettling chill. She smiled often, Her voice warmed when she spoke of the baby, but behind those smiles flickered a shadow she could not quite name. Damien's late nights had grown more frequent, his explanations vague, his laughter at dinner more hollow than before. He kissed her forehead each morning and promised he was working hard for their future. But in the quiet hours when she lay alone, her heart whispered questions she did not want to ask. Ilara had always believed in intuition, the subtle pull of the heart that warned of danger before the mind could understand it. She felt it now, in the way Damien avoided her gaze when she spoke of Lyra's nursery, in the hesitation that clung to his voice when she asked if he was happy. She wanted to dismiss it and convince herself that exhaustion explained everything, that the man who had given up an empire for her could not falter. And yet the unease grew, curling around her like a serpent, unseen but tightening. Damien carried his own torment like a chain around his neck. Each morning, he kissed Ilara goodbye. Each evening, he returned to her embrace, but the hours in between were filled with deception. He balanced precariously between two worlds, the world of his wife and child, where hope and innocence still glowed, and the world of Serafina, whose relentless demands consumed his thoughts. He told himself it was temporary, that he could control the fire he had ignited, but Serafina no longer accepted silence as an answer. Her pregnancy had reached its 8th week, and her body reminded her daily of the life they had created together. Alone in her apartment, she endured the waves of nausea, the exhaustion, the dizzying emotions, and with each passing day, her anger grew. She believed Damien when he whispered promises in the dark, and that he would one day step into the light with her. But now she watched him return again and again to Ilara, to the wife who still lived under the illusion of being his only love, and resentment turned into fury. When Damien visited her one evening, Serafina met him not with the allure of passion, but with icy resolve. Her eyes were sharp, her voice like glass breaking as she reminded him of the deadline she had set. "You have 1 week left, Damien. 1 week before, I will tell her myself, I will not raise this child as your hidden sin." Damien tried to reason with her, his voice desperate, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "Serafina, please. Ilara is fragile. She is carrying my daughter. If you tell her now, it will destroy her. I just need more time." "Time," Serafina snapped, pulling her hand away. "Every day that passes, I suffer alone while she basks in your love. You think I care if she is fragile. I am fragile, too, Damien. I am silent while you play husband in your perfect little home. I will not be invisible any longer." Her words cut him deeper than he expected. He saw in her eyes not only anger but pain, a raw wound festering from months of secrecy. For a fleeting moment, guilt for Serafina joined the guilt he carried for Ilara, and its weight nearly crushed him. He left her apartment that night with his heart in shards, knowing the storm was drawing closer and closer. At home, Ilara waited by the window, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the room. When Damien walked in, she looked up, her expression tender yet searching. "You are late again," she said quietly. Her tone was not accusatory, but the sorrow in her voice pierced him more sharply than anger ever could. He kissed her, whispering, "I am sorry, love. Work has been overwhelming." He placed his hand on her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of Lyra's movements. For a moment, the lie felt unbearable. He wanted to confess everything, to collapse at her feet and beg forgiveness. But cowardice bound his lips, and the silence stretched like a gulf neither dared to cross. In the days that followed, Ilara's unease grew stronger. She noticed that Chloe, Damien's assistant, seemed uncomfortable when she called the office. Her responses clipped, almost protective. She saw the way Damien's phone was never far from his hand, the way he left room to answer calls. At night, when she closed her eyes beside him, she sometimes dreamt of standing on a shore watching him drift further away. No matter how loudly she called, he did not hear her. Serafina, meanwhile, grew more volatile with each passing day. She sent Damien messages filled with rage, sometimes tears, promises of destruction. She reminded him of the child growing inside her, who deserved more than to be a secret. Her bitterness toward Ilara deepened, twisting into jealousy so sharp it consumed her every thought. She began imagining the confrontation, rehearsing the words she would hurl at the woman who lived the life she believed should have been hers. Damien, trapped in the crossfire, felt his control slipping. He drowned himself in work, burying his fear beneath numbers and contracts. But Serafina's shadow loomed even there. She appeared at his office uninvited, her presence a constant reminder that the truth would not stay buried. He begged her for patience, but patience was no longer in her vocabulary. Ilara, determined to protect the fragile peace of her world, tried to focus on the joy of her pregnancy. She poured herself into designing Lyra's nursery, choosing fabrics and colors, and creating a sanctuary for the soon-arriving daughter. But in the quiet corners of her heart, doubt gnawed relentlessly. She felt Damien slipping through her fingers, and, though she wanted to believe in his promises, a storm raged silently inside her, whispering that everything was not as it seemed. The gathering storm tightened around them all, its fury hidden but inevitable. Damien walked through his days with the haunted eyes of a man carrying secrets too heavy to bear. Ilara carried her child with the grace of hope, but also the ache of suspicion. Serafina carried her unborn child with resentment, her fury sharpening into resolve. And as the final days of Serafina's ultimatum approached, the silence between Damien and Ilara grew louder and heavier, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. The storm had not yet broken, but its clouds loomed over them, dark and merciless, ready to unleash their fury upon everything they had built. None of them knew that it would not simply wash away illusions when the storm finally erupted. It would tear apart the very foundations of love, loyalty, and trust, leaving behind ruins where once there had been dreams. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of Damien's office tower, golden rays spilling across polished floors that had witnessed countless negotiations and whispered betrayals. Outside, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the tension that crackled within the high-rise. Inside, a storm waited to be unleashed, forever altering the course of 3 entwined lives. Ilara woke that morning with a heart full of tenderness. At 39 weeks, every breath and step was heavy with the weight of the child she carried. Her hands instinctively rested on her swollen belly, tracing gentle circles as if soothing the little soul waiting within. She had grown used to the ache in her back and the restless nights, but today felt different. Today, she wanted to remind Damien of the love they shared, to remind herself that the shadows she had sensed were nothing but illusions of her weary mind. She rose early, preparing a basket filled with his favorite dishes. She arranged them with the meticulous care of someone who believed food could be an offering of devotion, a balm for weary hearts. She tied the ribbon around the basket's handle and whispered to her unborn daughter, "Today we will surprise your father. Today we will remind him of joy." Clara, her mother, watched from the kitchen doorway worriedly. She had noticed the distance growing between her daughter and Damien, the late-night silences, and the way Ilara sometimes stared into the dark with eyes glistened with unshed tears. But she said nothing, unwilling to add weight to a heart already carrying so much. Instead, she hugged Ilara gently and whispered, "Take care of yourself, my love." "And take care of her," Ilara smiled, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I will, Mama, I promise." Meanwhile, Damien sat in his office, his mind unraveling with every passing second. For weeks he had walked the edge of destruction, his life a precarious balance between 2 women and 2 unborn children. Serafina's ultimatum echoed in his mind, her fury pressing down on him like a vice. He had avoided her for days, hoping the problem would dissolve somehow. But Serafina was not a woman to be ignored. She had vowed to confront Ilara if Damien did not act, and he knew she could carry out that threat. His assistant, Chloe, had seen the change in him, the restless pacing, the bloodshot eyes, the frantic phone calls that ended in slammed doors. She worried for him and Ilara, who remained blissfully unaware of the darkness threatening to consume her world. When the elevator dinged that afternoon and Ilara stepped out, glowing with expectation and holding the basket of food, Chloe's stomach dropped. "Ilara," Chloe stammered, rushing forward, "you should not be here. Damien he's busy, very busy. It's not a good time." Ilara tilted her head, her smile gentle but firm. "I only want to see him for a moment." I want to surprise him." Chloe hesitated, torn between loyalty to her employer and compassion for the woman before her. Finally, she whispered urgently, "Please, trust me. You should come back later." But Ilara, filled with determination, shook her head. "No, I will see him now." She moved past Chloe, her steps steady despite the weight she carried. When she pushed open the heavy office door, the world she had built in her heart crumbled instantly. Damien stood near his desk, his shirt disheveled, his tie hanging loose, and in his arms, pressed against him with fevered desperation, was Serafina. Her lips were still wet from the kiss that had just ended, her eyes alight with triumph as they met Ilara's horrified gaze. For a moment, silence reigned, so heavy it seemed to smother the air. The basket slipped from Ilara's hands, tumbling to the floor, the sound of glass shattering echoing like the breaking of her heart. She stared at them, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes could not deny. Damien's face drained of color, his mouth opening but no words escaping. Serafina, however, wasted no time. Her hand brushed across her rounded belly, now unmistakably pregnant at 23 weeks, and she stepped forward with a cruel smile. "Yes, Ilara, you see it now, I am carrying his child. The life inside me is his, as much as the one inside you." The words pierced like knives. Ilara staggered back, her breath catching, her vision blurring with tears. The betrayal was not only in the kiss, not only in the secret revealed, but in the knowledge that Dame Isabelle Dubois shattered their vows, had desecrated the love she had built her life upon. Damien reached for her, his voice broken. "Ilara, please, listen." But Ilara's body betrayed her anguish. A searing pain tore through her hands clutching her belly as a sharp contraction gripped her with brutal force. The floor beneath her blurred as her knees buckled, water breaking in a flood that mirrored the shattering of her soul. Chaos erupted. Chloe rushed in, her scream cutting through the air as she called for an ambulance. Damien dropped to his knees beside Ilara, his hands trembling as he tried to steady her. "Stay with me, Ilara. Please, stay with me." But she turned her face away, her eyes filled not with love but with a resolve he had never seen before. With trembling fingers, she pulled her phone from her bag and dialed emergency services herself, refusing his touch and presence. She would not let him claim this moment after what he had done. The paramedics arrived quickly, lifting her onto a stretcher as she clutched her belly, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Damien tried to follow, but Ilara's voice, hoarse with pain yet sharp with authority, cut through the room. "Do not come near me. Do not come near us ever again." The words struck him harder than any blow. He froze in the doorway, watching as she was carried into the waiting ambulance, her strength radiating even in the midst of agony. Serafina stood in the corner, her arms folded across her stomach, her eyes cold with satisfaction. When the ambulance doors closed, Damien collapsed into the chair behind his desk, his head in his hands. The storm he had tried to contain had finally broken, and he had lost everything in its fury. Ilara, despite the pain ripping through her body, held her head high as the ambulance sped through the city. She whispered to her daughter, her voice trembling but resolute, "We will survive this. I will protect you. We will never need him again." The illusion had shattered, the world had broken, but the unyielding brave from the wreckage began to rise. Ilara Vance, betrayed and heartbroken, was no longer the woman who had once believed in fairy tales. She was something more substantial, something unbreakable, and though the night ahead would test her more than ever, she had already chosen her path. She would face this battle alone, and she would win. The sterile light of the hospital room flickered faintly against white walls as Ilara lay on the bed, her breath, her body consumed by waves of pain that tore through her with merciless rhythm. The world had collapsed around her only hours before, but now she focused on the tiny life struggling to enter existence. Doctors and nurses moved swiftly around her, their voices calm yet urgent, but she could barely hear them over the roar of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She clutched the sheets with trembling fingers, her face slick with sweat, her hair plastered against her cheeks. Through the haze of agony, one thought burned brighter than all others. She would bring her daughter into this world alone, free from the shadow of betrayal. No matter how much her heart ached, she would not let Damien's sins taint the first moments of her child's life. When the final push came, Ilara screamed, her cry filled with both anguish and defiance, and then silence fell, broken only by the sharp, desperate wail of a newborn child. The sound pierced through Ilara's pain, filling her with a tidal wave of emotion so overwhelming it nearly broke her. Tears streamed down her face as the nurse placed the tiny bundle into her arms. Lyra Rose Vance. The name whispered through her mind as she gazed at the small, perfect face against her chest. Tiny fingers curled around her thumb with surprising strength, and in that fragile grip, Ilara felt the stirrings of a new power within herself. She had lost everything in a single afternoon: trust, marriage, the illusion of happiness, but in return, she had gained something far greater. She had gained a reason to fight, a reason to rise. Clara, standing at the bedside, wept openly as she leaned over to stroke her granddaughter's cheek. "She is perfect, Ilara," she whispered. "Perfect and strong, just like her mother." Ilara's voice shook, but her eyes blazed with determination. "She will carry my name. She will not bear the name of a man who betrayed us. From this day forward, she is Lyra Vance." The decision was final, severing the last tie that bound her to Damien. She filed for divorce within days, and her lawyers were swift and unyielding. Custody of Lyra would belong to her and her alone. Damien's desperate attempts to reach her were met with silence. When he called, she refused to answer. When he sent flowers, they were discarded. When he begged through letters, they remained unopened, lying untouched in the bottom of a drawer. Damie Isabelle Dubois'd been there outside the hospital that night, his face pale and broken, but Ilara had turned her back to him. Security guards kept him from entering, and she ensured it stayed that way. The sight of him, disheveled and hollow-eyed, had almost torn her resolve, but then she remembered the look on Serafina's face, the cruel smile, the hand resting possessively over the child in her belly. That memory was enough to steel Ilara's will forever. Life as a single mother was not easy, but Ilara embraced it with the ferocity of a warrior queen. In the early weeks, sleepless nights blurred into endless days, her body weary, her emotions raw. She fed Lyra in the quiet hours of dawn, rocking her gently while whispering promises of protection. She soothed her cries with lullabies, tears often streaming down her face as she held her daughter close. She had moments of weakness, moments when exhaustion threatened to crush her, but she refused to let despair claim her again. Clara became her steadfast ally, guiding her with patience and love. Together, they transformed Ilara's apartment into a nursery and office, where Lyra's laughter mingled with the scratch of pencils on drafting paper. Germa Design, the architectural firm Ilara had poured her soul into, became her sanctuary. Clients who admired her resilience flocked to her, inspired by her designs and the strength radiating from her story. The scandal of Damien's betrayal spread quickly, but instead of diminishing her, it elevated her. She became a symbol of endurance, of reinvention, of rising from ashes with dignity. Damien, however, lingered like a ghost on the edges of her life. He begged for chances to see Lyra, but Ilara's lawyers ensured his access was limited, supervised, and rare. Even then, Lyra would not reach for him or calm in his arms. She cried for her mother, for the warmth she recognized, for the safety she knew. Each rejection was a knife in Damien's chest, a reminder that his choices had cost him the family he once cherished. Ilara did not rejoice in his pain, nor did she pity him. He had chosen his path, and now she chose hers. She chose, decided. She put her heart into her work and her daughter, creating a future that betrayal could not destroy. Months passed, and with each one, Ilara grew stronger. She shed the fragility of the woman who once believed in fairy tales and emerged as something far greater. A queen of her own kingdom, ruling with wisdom carved from suffering and love forged in fire. Her designs won acclaim across the city, praised for their elegance and innovation. She stood on stages, accepting awards with Lyra perched on her hip, a living testament to the strength that had carried her through. On the other hand, Serafina learned quickly that Damien was no savior. Though he bore his son, she soon realized he could never be hers. The empire she had imagined crumbled beneath her feet, and her bitterness deepened. But that story was hers to bear, and Ilara no longer cared to follow it. For Ilara, every day was a declaration. Every blueprint she drafted, every structure she built, was a monument to survival, resilience, and the truth that betrayal could break her heart but not her spirit. And every laugh from Lyra, every small hand clutching hers, reminded her that the greatest revenge was not destruction but creation, building something beautiful from ruins. On one quiet evening, months after Lyra's birth, Ilara stood at her apartment window with her daughter in her arms. The city lights twinkled below, and the air carried the scent of rain. She kissed Lyra's forehead and whispered, "We will not be defined by what was lost. We will be defined by what we create." Her reflection in the glass showed not a broken woman, but a sovereign, her crown invisible yet undeniable. Betrayal had tried to destroy her, but instead, it had given birth to a queen. And as Lyra's tiny breaths warmed her chest, Ilara knew her journey was only beginning. For though the scars of the past still lingered, she was no longer the woman who trembled in the face of loss. She was Ilara Vance, mother, architect, survivor, and queen of her destiny. And no man, no betrayal, no storm could ever take that away. The whispers of betrayal spread quickly through Atlanta's polished halls of power, moving from hushed conversations at glittering galas to sharp-tongued gossip in boardrooms. Damien Thorne's once revered name began to fracture under the weight of scandal. He had been a man born to rule, the heir to a dynasty of steel and stone, yet now he walked through the city streets cloaked in disgrace. His parents, Eleanor and Arthur Thorne, who had once raised him as their golden child, turned their backs in public silence and private condemnation. Their empire had no room for weakness. Weakness was all they saw when they looked at him. Ilara's victory was quiet but devastating. She never sought to destroy him openly, yet her refusal to take him back and her decision to raise Lyra under her own name echoed louder than any words. Society, ever eager to find a hero and a villain, painted Ilara as the woman wronged, the phoenix rising from ashes, and Damien as the man who had squandered love, honor, and legacy. Invitations to events grew fewer, contracts slipped from his grasp, and partners distanced themselves from a man tainted with scandal. But Damien's downfall was not only professional, it was deeply personal, unraveling the life he had once envisioned. At night, he wandered his empty apartment with bottles of whiskey half drained, staring at the photographs he could not bear to throw away. Ilara's smile haunted him, and Lyra's tiny hands reached for him in dreams, only to dissolve into mist when he woke. The silence of those rooms was unbearable, yet he deserved it, and he knew it. Serafina Hayes, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. She had once believed Damien would choose her, that her beauty and cunning, coupled with the child she carried, would elevate her from mistress to rightful partner. But her fantasy dissolved in the sterile walls of the hospital where she delivered her son, Leo. Damien was there briefly, his face pale and eyes hollow, but his heart was not hers. Even as he held the newborn child, his thoughts drifted to Lyra, to Ilara, to the life he had destroyed. Serafina saw it, and the realization gutted her. She had won nothing. She was left with a man broken beyond repair, and a child who would never be recognized fully by the family whose blood he bore. Her ambition, once a flame that had driven her into Damien's arms, now turned against her. Resentment seeped into her veins, resentment for Damien's weakness, resentment for Ilara's strength, resentment even for herself. The months after Leo's birth were marked by loneliness and frustration. Damien grew more distant, drowning in his despair, incapable of giving her the devotion she craved. She had sacrificed her dignity for him, and in return, she received only half-empty promises and guilt-soaked apologies. When she confronted him, her voice laced with venom, Damien could offer no solace. He was too broken, too consumed by his failures to give her anything but fragments of a man. During one of those arguments, Leo's cries echoing through the apartment, Serafina made her choice. She would not raise her son in the shadows of Damien's ruin. She deserved more, and so did her child. Marcus Chen entered her life quietly but firmly, a businessman with a keen mind and a steady heart. He had known Serafina before, had admired her fire, and when he saw her now, wounded but unyielding, he offered what Damien never could. stability, respect, and unconditional acceptance. At first, Serafina resisted, still tethered to the ghost of the life she had imagined with Damien. But Marcus was patient. He held Leo tenderly, spoke of futures without bitterness, and showed her that ambition could be built not on the ruins of another's empire, but on the foundations of integrity. Slowly, reluctantly, she allowed herself to believe in him, and when Marcus asked to make Leo his son in name and in love, Serafina wept, not from regret, but from the relief of finally letting go. Damien learned of this only after it was done. Serafina had moved to San Francisco with Marcus, leaving behind the city that had witnessed her scandal and shame. Damien received a brief letter, its words cold and final. She thanked him for Leo's life but declared that he had no place. She had chosen a man who could give her child the stability Damien never could. The letter ended with a single sentence that burned into Damien's soul. "You gave me nothing but pain, and I will not let my son inherit it." For days, Damien did not rise from bed. He replayed every moment, every choice, until they twisted into a torment that left him hollow. He had lost Elara, lost Lyra, lost Serafina, lost Leo. The empire his parents had promised him was stripped away, his reputation shattered, his future bleak. All that remained was the bottle in his hand and the crushing weight of memory. Eleanor and Arthur watched their son's downfall with sorrow and disdain. They did not soften, for theirs was a world that did not forgive weakness. They removed his name from the family trust, cut him out of the inheritance, and redirected their wealth into charities and foundations where their legacy would not be tainted by scandal. Eleanor, once the fiercest protector of her son, declared to her circle of friends that Damien was no longer the heir of Thorn, a cautionary tale to her, a reminder that even golden sons could tarnish. Yet, even as society erased him, Damien clung to fragments of hope. He tried on occasion to see Lyra through the visitation rights granted by the court, but those visits were painful. The little girl cried in his arms, pushing away from the stranger she did not recognize. She clung to Elara, or, in later visits, to Ethan Reed, the man who had begun to step into the role Dame Isabelle Dubois forfeited. Each time Lyra called another man father, Damien's heart cracked further, the soundless fracture of a man already broken. For Elara, Damien's downfall was both painful and liberating. She did not celebrate his ruin, for a part of her still remembered the man who had once defied his family for love. But she could not forget the betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. Watching him collapse under the weight of his choices only reinforced her decision to build a life free of his shadow. She poured her strength into her daughter and her work, creating a future that did not depend on anyone else's loyalty. The contrast between them grew sharper with each passing year. Elara rose, her designs winning acclaim, and her story inspired countless women who had been told they could not survive without the men who betrayed them. Damien fell, spiraling deeper into despair, a Isabelle Dubois hunted by ghosts of what might have been. And Serafina, once the villain of Elara's story, found her redemption far away, in the arms of a man who saw not her ambition or past but the woman she could become. Thus, the empire that had seemed invincible crumbled, not with a single blow but with 1,000 fractures born of betrayal, weakness, and pride. And amid the ruins, Elara Vance stood tall, holding her daughter, her crown forged not of gold but of resilience. The tragedy of Serafina was that she had reached for the stars and grasped only shadows, but in letting go, she found a future brighter than the one she had stolen. The tragedy of Damien was that he had been handed the world and lost it because he could not protect the one thing that mattered most. And the triumph of Elara was that from the ashes of both their downfalls, she rose unbroken and unbowed, the true queen of the life she had built. 15 months had passed since the night Elara had brought Lyra into the world. 15 months since she had stood alone and declared her independence from the man who had betrayed her. In that time, the jagged edges of her broken heart had begun to smooth, though the scars remained as reminders of what she had endured. She was no longer the fragile woman who had once begged the universe to make love eternal. She was Ilara Vance, survivor, architect, mother, and every step she took carried the authority of a queen who had risen from ruin. Lyra had grown into a bright, inquisitive child with wide eyes that reflected her mother's determination. She filled their small apartment with laughter and mischief, her presence turning even the darkest moments into light. Lyra often watched her daughter and whispered silent thanks for the strength that had carried them through the storm. Lyra was her legacy, her joy, her reminder that even when betrayal had tried to destroy her, life had blessed her with a gift far greater than any pain Damien could inflict. But strength came at a cost. Lyra's life was a delicate balance of motherhood and ambition. Her days were spent drafting designs, attending meetings, and fighting for her place in a world still dominated by men who looked at her with admiration and skepticism. At night, when Lyra finally slept, Lyra pored over contracts and blueprints, her candle burning long after the city lights had dimmed. Success followed her relentless drive. Her firm, Germa Design, flourished under her leadership. She had just been awarded the Southeastern Architectural Excellence Award for her innovative children's hospital design. This project had captured the community's hearts and her peers' respect. At the ceremony celebrating her award, she first crossed paths with Ethan Reed. He was not a man who entered quietly. His presence radiated calm strength, the kind that did not need to demand attention because it already commanded it. At 34, Ethan Isabelle Dubois built Green Oasis Resorts, a hospitality empire renowned for its sustainability and innovation. But unlike Damien, his success carried no arrogance. His eyes were steady, his smile genuine, and when he extended his hand to congratulate her, Ilara felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Your designs are remarkable," Ethan said, his voice even, his tone sincere. "You do not just create buildings. You create hope." Accustomed to flattery, Ilara found herself momentarily disarmed by the weight of his words. She met his gaze, searching for the hidden motives that often lurked behind such compliments, but found none. Instead, she saw curiosity and admiration, untainted by condescension or desire to manipulate. She thanked him politely and intended to let the conversation fade into the sea of handshakes and hollow praises. Yet Ethan lingered, asking about her vision and the inspirations behind her work. His questions were thoughtful, not the perfunctory inquiries of someone seeking to impress, but the genuine interest of a man who valued her mind as much as her accomplishments. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again and again, sometimes at industry events, in the quiet corners of cafes where they worked. Each meeting was unplanned yet strangely inevitable, as though the universe were weaving their lives together thread by thread. Ethan never pressed, never intruded, but he was always present, steady as the ground beneath her feet. Ilara, wary and protective, kept her distance at first. She had been burned too deeply to let another man close so easily. She had Lyra to protect, and would not allow anyone to step into their world without proving himself worthy. Ethan seemed to understand this without her needing to explain. He never asked for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he built trust slowly, brick by brick, with small acts of kindness. He brought coffee to her office during long nights, remembered details she mentioned in passing, and never shied away from acknowledging Lyra as part of her life. The first time Ethan met Lyra was unplanned. Ilara had brought her daughter to the office when her mother was ill, and Ethan arrived with documents for a joint project. Lyra, perched on the floor with crayons in her tiny hands, looked up at him with wide eyes. For a moment, Ilara feared the awkwardness that often followed when men realized her daughter came first. But Ethan sat down, asked Lyra what she was drawing, and listened intently as the little girl explained her rainbow castles and imaginary animals. He did not treat her as an inconvenience or a footnote. He treated her as someone who mattered. That night, after Lyra had fallen asleep, Ilara thought of Ethan's gentle smile and the ease with which he had stepped into her daughter's world. It frightened her, how easily he had slipped past the walls she had built. But it also stirred something long buried, a longing not for romance, but for partnership, for a man who saw not just her beauty or strength, but her entire life and embraced it. Ethan's presence began to grow in their lives, not as a sudden intrusion, but as a steady rhythm. He joined them for walks in the park, where Lyra's laughter echoed as she ran ahead. He cooked dinner with Alara in her small kitchen, his hands clumsy with a knife, but his laughter filled the room with warmth. He never sought to replace anyone, never pushed boundaries, but slowly, naturally, he became a part of their story. Damien, however, lingered in the background like a ghost refusing to rest. His supervised visits with Lyra had grown increasingly painful as his daughter continued to resist him, clinging instead to Alara or even to Ethan when he was present. Each rejection carved deeper into his already broken soul. He began to notice how Lyra's face lit up when she saw Ethan, and how she called for him with innocent affection. To Damien, it was salt in an unhealed wound. He had lost Alara, but losing his daughter's heart to another man was a torment he could not bear. Though aware of Damien's bitterness, he refused to let it dictate her choices. She had once sacrificed her happiness for the illusion of love and would not repeat that mistake. She recognized Ethan's patience and his unwavering respect for her boundaries, and slowly, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps love could exist without deceit. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Ethan sat across from her at the dining table, Lyra asleep in the next room. He looked at her with a calm intensity that made her breath catch. "Alara," he said quietly, "I do not want to rush you. I know you carry scars, and I respect them. But I need you to know that I am here. For you, for Lyra, for as long as you will let me be." The words hung in the air, tender and powerful. Alara's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something she had not felt in years, hope. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it met his. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by betrayal, but by trust, respect, and love. And in that moment, under the lamp's soft glow, she realized she was not just surviving anymore, she was living. A new love had risen from the ashes of her broken world, and though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined her. She was Alara Vance, ready to embrace the light again. The night air over Atlanta was heavy with rain, each drop striking the pavement like the ticking of a relentless clock. Damien Thorne stood at the edge of his apartment balcony, the city's glittering skyline stretching before him, mocking him with its brilliance. He had once ruled this view, had once been the golden heir whose name opened doors and bent futures. Now he was a ghost haunting the edges of a life that no longer belonged to him. The liquor in his hand burned less than the emptiness in his chest, and though he told himself he drank to forget, he knew the truth. He drank to remember. It had been over 2 years since Alara had left him. 2 years since Lyra's birth had marked the beginning of his exile. In that time, he had watched from the shadows as Alara rose higher than ever. She had become the symbol of resilience, the architect whose name inspired trust and admiration. Her designs graced the front pages of magazines. Her speeches filled auditoriums with women who saw in her the embodiment of strength. She had taken what was meant to destroy her and turned it into a crown. And beside her now stood Ethan Reed. Dame Isabelle Dubois seen them together, watched as Ethan carried Lyra on his shoulders in the park, and heard the little girl's laughter carried on the wind. The sound haunted him. Worse still was the word he had heard Lyra cry out one afternoon, a word that shattered him with cruel finality. Daddy. Not spoken to him, but to Ethan, the man who had stolen not only his wife's love, but his daughter's heart. Each supervised visit with Lyra only deepened the wound. She did not know him. She cried in his arms, reaching desperately for Alara or Ethan. She looked at him with wide, wary eyes, like he were a stranger. And in truth, he was. His choices had carved that distance. His betrayal had built the wall between them. But the knowledge did not lessen his torment. It only fueled his obsession. Damien told himself he still loved Alara, and that love drove everything he did, but the truth was darker, tangled in pride, regret, and desperation. He could not bear to see her happy in another man's arms, and he could not accept that Isabelle Dubois succeeded where he had failed. Ethan's very existence to him was an insult, a reminder that he had been replaced, erased, and forgotten. Ilara and Ethan's engagement party invitations arrived like a thunderclap across the city's elite. The event would be held at Swan House, one of Atlanta's most iconic mansions, a place of history and grandeur. It was to be no ordinary celebration. Ilara, always strategic, planned the event as a declaration, a coronation of sorts. She would stand before the world not as the woman betrayed, but as the woman reborn, a queen who had forged her empire from ashes. When Damien learned of it, something inside him snapped. He could not allow it. He could not watch her pledge her life to another man while he stood cast aside. He told himself that if he disrupted the event and forced the truth into the open, Ilara would remember what they had once shared. Perhaps she would hate him, but hatred was better than indifference. Anything was better than watching her smile at Ethan with the same tenderness she had once reserved for him. His plan began as a whisper in his mind, fragile and dangerous, but it grew with every night. He would crash the engagement party. He would expose Ethan and tear apart the perfect facade that Ilara had built. He convinced himself there had to be skeletons in Ethan's closet, some hidden flaw, some dark secret waiting to be unearthed. For weeks, he hired investigators, digging through Ethan's past, desperate to find a crack in the armor, but there was nothing. Ethan's record was immaculate. His business practices were clean, his reputation spotless, his private life free of scandal. The more Damien searched, the more the truth became unbearable. Ethan was everything Damien was not. Unable to find weakness in Ethan, Damien turned his obsession elsewhere. He would create chaos with lies if he could. He began drafting stories, concocting rumors, plotting scenes that would stain Ethan's character before the eyes of the elite. He imagined standing in the grand hall of Swan House, his voice booming as he revealed Ethan's supposed betrayals. He pictured the shock on Ilara's face, the gasps of the crowd, the crumbling of the empire she had built upon this new love. In his twisted mind, this was justice. This was reclaiming what had been stolen from him. But even as his obsession consumed him, fragments of the man he once was fought to surface. Late at night, when the alcohol had dulled his fury, he would remember Ilara's laughter, her hand in his, how she had once believed in him against all odds. He would remember the promise he had whispered on their wedding day, the vow never to betray her. Guilt clawed at him, reminding him that his downfall had been of his own. Yet when morning came, guilt was drowned beneath the tidal wave of his need to act, to do something, anything, to stop her from walking away forever. His former assistant, Chloe, was one of the few who still spoke to him, though her patience grew thinner with each meeting. She found him one evening, surrounded by empty bottles and crumpled papers filled with half-formed schemes. "Damien," she said, her voice sharp with frustration, "you must let her go. This obsession will kill you. She has moved on. She is happy. And you need help." Her words stung because they were true, but Damien's eyes blazed with defiance as he whispered, "She was mine, Chloe. She was mine, and he stole her. I cannot let him win." Chloe looked at him with pity and something like sorrow. She had once admired and believed in his brilliance, but now she saw only a man unraveling, consumed by ghosts. She left him that night, and he knew she would not return. As the engagement party date drew near, Damien's obsession reached a fever pitch. He rehearsed his intrusion in his mind, imagining the silence that would fall when he entered the hall, the collective breath held as he revealed his accusations. He saw Ilara's face, not as it was now, but as it had been years ago, filled with love and vulnerability. He told himself that if he could just reach her heart again and remind her of what they had once shared, she would not turn away. But the truth was clear to everyone but him. Ilara's love for him had died the day she collapsed on his office floor, betrayed by his embrace with Serafina. The woman she had become no longer needed him, no longer even hated him. She had risen beyond him, and nothing he did could drag her back into the shadows he inhabited. Still, Damien could not stop. He prepared his suit, polished his shoes, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were hollow, his face lined with despair, but in his mind, he was ready for battle. He was ready to reclaim what he believed was his, even if it meant destroying everything. The storm inside him had peaked, and as the night of the engagement approached, Atlanta seemed to tremble with anticipation. The Swan House would soon open its doors to a celebration of love and triumph. But broken and obsessed, Damien Thorne would arrive not as a guest, but as a harbinger of chaos. The final plot had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The grandeur of the Swan House stood like a sentinel of history, its white columns gleaming beneath the flood of golden evening lights. It was a place where Atlanta's elite had long gathered to sip champagne and whisper secrets. But this night it was transformed into something more than a social venue. For Alara Vance it would become a stage, a throne room, a battlefield, and a coronation. Inside the mansion, the preparations unfolded with flawless precision. Florists had adorned the hall with cascades of lilies and orchids, their fragrance mingling with the hum of violins rehearsing for the evening. Tables were draped in silks of emerald and ivory, crystals catching the candlelight with a shimmer that resembled stars fallen to earth. Guests would dine on the finest delicacies, toast with vintage champagne, and marvel at the opulence and the woman who had risen to host it. Alara stood before the mirror in her private dressing room, her gown flowing around her like liquid midnight, studded with gems that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was swept into an elegant crown of curls, her eyes lined with the strength of a woman who had survived ruin and emerged unbroken. Lyra, now a toddling child of 2, giggled beside her, tugging at the hem of her dress with tiny hands. Alara bent down, lifting her daughter into her arms, kissing her cheek. "Tonight," Alara whispered, her voice trembling with nerves and anticipation, "we show the world who we are. Not victims, not abandoned, but queens." Clara entered quietly, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at her daughter. "You are ready," she said. "Your father would be proud of what you have built, Alara. And Lyra will grow up knowing her mother's strength." Alara smiled faintly, her gaze returning to the mirror. "This is more than an engagement party. This is a declaration. Damien thought he broke me, but we'll see that he only forged me tonight." Ethan Reed entered a moment later, his presence steady and grounding. He wore a classic black suit, his shoulders broad, his smile warm. When he saw Alara, his breath caught for a moment, but unlike Damien, he did not see her as a conquest or possession. He saw her as his equal, his partner, his queen. "You are radiant," he said simply, and though the words were quiet, they carried more weight than any grand compliment. He took Lyra from her arms, bouncing her gently until she squealed with laughter, then looked back at Alara. "Are you ready?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady, more than ever. Behind the elegance of the evening lay a plan woven with precision. Alara had chosen Swan House not merely for its beauty but for its symbolism. Generations of Atlanta's elite had held court there, but tonight it would witness the ascendancy of a woman who had once been cast out. Every guest invited represented a piece of her past, her present, or her future. Politicians who once sneered at her now scrambled to be seen by her side. Business magnates who had dismissed her as fragile now courted her contracts. Even Eleanor and Arthur Thorne, the parents who had once disowned her, were invited, their acceptance a tacit acknowledgement of her power. But the greatest surprise was the one Alara held close to her chest, a secret she intended to unveil at the height of the night. Weeks earlier, she had finalized the purchase of the Thorne estate, the sprawling mansion that had once been the pride of Damien's lineage. With Ethan's help, she had transformed it into the headquarters of the Vance Reed Foundation, dedicated to supporting single mothers and abandoned children. Tonight, she would announce it publicly, reclaiming the estate and the legacy it represented. As the first guests began to arrive, the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lingered outside, snapping photographs of limousines gliding up the drive. Inside, champagne glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and whispers rose in crescendos as eyes turned toward the grand staircase where Alara would soon enter. Damien Thorne, however, was already there. He had slipped into the crowd unnoticed, his face pale, his eyes hollow but burning with obsession. He wore a suit that hung loosely on his frame, his once impeccable grooming marred by shadows of exhaustion. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, imagining the hush that would fall when he revealed his accusations, the gasps of betrayal that would follow. He believed the night could not go on without him, and that the story of Alara and Ethan was incomplete without his interruption. But Alara knew he would come. She had anticipated it, woven it into her plan like a final act of a tragedy. For she understood Damien better than he understood himself. His pride would not allow him to stay away. His obsession would drive him into the lion's den, and when he appeared, she would not cower as she once had. She would face him before the world and bury the ghost of their past once and for all. The orchestra struck its first chord as Alara descended the staircase, her gown flowing behind her like a midnight river. Gasps filled the hall as she appeared radiant and regal, with Lyra on her hip and Ethan at her side. She greeted her guests with grace, every movement deliberate, every smile a reminder of the power she now wielded. Conversations hushed as she took her place at the center of the hall. Ethan stood beside her, and Lyra clapped her tiny hands as though she sensed the importance of the night. To the guests it was a celebration of love and triumph. To Alara it was something far greater. It was a coronation. Damien watched from the shadows, his fists clenched, his heart pounding. He saw Ethan's hand resting on Alara's back, the tenderness in her eyes when she looked at him, and Lyra's joyful cries of "ha-ha" as she reached for Ethan. Each sight tore at him until his vision blurred with rage. He could not wait. He would not wait. But Alara was already preparing to speak. She stepped forward, the room falling silent as her voice rang out with clarity. "Tonight is not only about love," she began, her words commanding attention. "It is about victory. It is about survival. It is about reclaiming what was lost and building something greater from the ruins." Applause rippled through the hall, but she raised her hand, silencing them. Her gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Eleanor and Arthur, whose eyes glistened with complex emotions. Then she continued, "Some of you know my story. I was betrayed, abandoned, and told I would never rise again. But betrayal is not the end. It is the beginning. Tonight, I stand not as the broken woman, but as the woman who rebuilt herself. And I do not stand alone. I stand with my daughter, my partner, and all of you who have believed in me." The crowd erupted in applause, but Alara was not finished. She gestured to a large draped canvas at the far end of the hall. A nod to Ethan pulled the cloth away, revealing a detailed rendering of the newly transformed Thorn estate. "This," she declared, her voice fierce with pride, "is the new home of the Vance Reed Foundation, dedicated to single mothers and children in need. A place where no one will ever feel abandoned, where no one will ever be told they are not enough." The hall erupted again in thunderous applause, cheers echoing against the marble walls. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Arthur bowed his head, the weight of his legacy shifting before his eyes. And in that moment, Damien stepped forward, his voice breaking the applause like glass shattering. "Lies!" he shouted, his words slurred with desperation. "She is not what she claims. She is mine. She will always be mine." Gasps filled the hall as all eyes turned toward him. Alara stood tall, her gaze locking with his, unflinching, regal, ready for the confrontation she had long awaited. The queen had prepared for her final battle, and the world was watching. The hall of Swanhouse erupted in a collective gasp as Damien's voice shattered the air. Once and pristine, his figure looked gaunt and unsteady beneath the chandelier's golden glow. His suit hung loosely on his frame, his tie askew, his face pale and sweaty. Yet his eyes burned with a manic fire that could not be reasoned with and born of desperation. He pointed toward Alara, his voice trembling yet loud enough to pierce the silence. "She belongs to me, she always will. This man is nothing. He is a thief who has stolen what is mine." The orchestra faltered, their instruments silenced mid-note. Guests exchanged horrified glances, whispers rising like a storm. Some stepped back in discomfort, others leaned forward, sensing the drama about to unfold. At the center of it all, Elara stood perfectly still, her midnight gown shimmering like armor, her chin lifted in quiet defiance. Beside her, Ethan tensed, shifting his body slightly as if to shield her, but Elara raised a hand. She did not need protection, not anymore. "Damien," she said at last, her voice calm yet carrying through the hall with the weight of command. "You should not have come." Her words struck like a verdict, final and cold. But Damien pressed forward, stumbling slightly as if pulled by invisible strings. "You think you can erase me? You think this charade makes you whole? You and I are bound forever. You carry my name, my blood runs in our daughter. Nothing can change that." Elara's eyes narrowed, the flicker of fury sparking beneath her composure. "You are wrong. Lyra does not carry your name, she carries mine, and she will never inherit your betrayal." The words rippled through the hall, and for a moment Damien faltered, his face contorting with rage and pain. Guests murmured in shock at the revelation, their eyes darting between the broken man and the regal woman before him. Eleanor and Arthur Thorne sat frozen near the front, Eleanor's hands trembling as she reached for her husband. Arthur's jaw clenched, his eyes heavy with shame. Damien turned on the crowd, his voice rising in desperation. "Do you not see? This woman, this so-called queen, is a liar. She pretends to be strong, but she is nothing without me, nothing." His voice cracked, and the echo of his words seemed to crumble beneath the weight of their hollowness. Elara stepped forward, her gown trailing behind her like the mantle of a sovereign. She raised the microphone, her gaze never leaving Damien. "You say I am nothing without you," she began, her tone steady but edged with steel. "But the truth, Damien, is that I am everything despite you. You tried to break me but only taught me how to rise. You betrayed me, but you gave me the strength to stand alone. You abandoned our daughter, but you made me realize that love is not defined by blood, but by devotion." The crowd erupted in applause, a thunderous wave that drowned out Damien's ragged protests. He raised his hands, trying to shout over them, but his voice was swallowed by the sheer force of Elara's presence. She raised her hand again, and silence fell. "I will tell you what defines me," Elara continued, her voice clear and resonant. "Not your betrayal, not your weakness, but my resilience, my daughter's laughter, the love of a man who stands beside me, not because he needs to own me, but because he respects me." As she turned slightly, her gaze softening as it fell on Ethan. He stepped forward, taking her hand in his, then dropped to one knee before the assembled crowd. A hush fell over the hall as he opened a small velvet box, the light catching on the ring within. "Elara Vance," Ethan said, his voice carrying the sincerity of a man who had waited patiently. "I have seen your strength, courage, and heart. I do not ask to complete it for you because you are already whole. I only ask to walk beside you, honor you, and love you for as long as I live. Will you marry me?" The crowd held its breath, waiting. Elara's eyes filled with tears, but not of sorrow. They were tears of triumph, of joy, of healing. She nodded slowly, her voice breaking with emotion as she whispered, "Yes." Applause thundered through the hall, guests rising to their feet in celebration. Lyra, perched in Clara's arms, clapped her tiny hands, her laughter ringing like the sweetest blessing. Eleanor Thorne covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly, while Arthur bowed his head, the weight of his son's disgrace crushing him. Damien, however, could bear no more. He surged forward, his face contorted in rage, his voice a strangled roar. "No, you cannot do this, she is mine." But security was already moving, intercepting him before he could reach the stage. He struggled violently, shouting incoherent protests, his body writhing against the men who held him. The sight was pitiful, a fallen prince reduced to a desperate, broken man before the eyes of the very society he had once commanded. Guests averted their gazes, some whispering in disgust, others shaking their heads in pity. Elara did not flinch. She watched him with eyes that no longer burned with hurt, only with the clarity of finality. When the room grew silent again, she raised the microphone again, her voice unwavering. "This is the truth," she declared. The past cannot bind me. The man who betrayed me has no power over me. Tonight, I claim my freedom, my love, and my future, and I will build a legacy that no one can destroy." She gestured toward the unveiled rendering of the Vance Reed Foundation, the symbol of her triumph. The audience rose again in applause, their voices echoing like thunder against the marble walls. Tears streaming down her face, Eleanor Thorne stood and spoke, her voice trembling but strong. "Ilara," she said, hurrying across the hall, "I once turned my back on you. I thought you were unworthy of our name. Tonight, I see the truth. You are more than worthy. You are the daughter I should have claimed from the beginning." Gasps followed her words, and Arthur nodded silently, his eyes glassy with regret. The acknowledgement was more potent than any title, more final than any inheritance. Damien, hearing his mother's declaration, collapsed into silence, his struggles ceasing as he hung limply in the guard's grip. His empire was gone. His family had renounced him. His wife had become a queen in her own right. The celebration resumed with renewed fervor, champagne glasses lifted, music swelling, voices rising in joy. Ethan slipped the ring onto Ilara's finger, sealing their union in the eyes of all who mattered. Lyra giggled, clapping as if she understood the magnitude of the moment. Clara held her granddaughter close, her heart swelling with pride. And Ilara, standing at the center of it all, felt the weight of the crown she had forged not from jewels, but from scars. She was no longer the woman who once trembled in the face of betrayal. She was a queen, crowned not by love alone, but by survival, resilience, and triumph. The night's drama had been shattered, its chaos laid bare, but something greater stood in its place. A coronation, a declaration, a legacy that would endure beyond betrayal, beyond loss, beyond time. For Ilara Vance, the coronation night was not just the beginning of her new life. It was the final burial of the old one, and as she looked into Ethan's eyes, her daughter's laughter echoing through the hall, she knew she had finally won. The echoes of applause still lingered in the vaulted ceilings of Swan House, long after the orchestra played its final note. Guests drifted away in murmurs of awe, their eyes bright with the spectacle they had witnessed, their hearts moved by the transformation of a woman who had turned her greatest betrayal into her greatest triumph. Outside, the night air was cool and fragrant with magnolia blossoms, and the city itself seemed to pause in reverence, as if acknowledging that history had been written within those walls. Ilara stood atop the grand staircase, her hand entwined with Ethan's, Lyra resting sleepily against her shoulder. Her heart was free of the shadows that had haunted it for the first time in years. She looked down at the courtyard below, where the last guests offered farewells and disappeared into the night. The glow of lanterns shimmered across the marble, and the world felt at peace. She breathed deeply, the air crisp and clean, carrying the scent of beginnings. Beside her, Ethan squeezed her hand. His eyes, steady and unwavering, reflected none of the chaos Dame Isabelle Dubois brought into the evening. He had not needed to fight for her in grand gestures. His love had been proven in the quiet moments, his patience and his refusal to demand more than she could give. Tonight had been her coronation and their union, a joining of two lives that had chosen each other not out of desperation, but out of truth. "You did more than endure," Ethan whispered, his voice meant only for her. "You conquered." Ilara turned to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I did not conquer alone. You gave me the courage to open my heart again, and Lyra, she gave me the strength to rise when I thought I could not." Lyra stirred in her arms, her small voice murmuring a dream-born word. Ilara kissed her daughter's forehead and felt her chest tighten with gratitude so profound it almost hurt. She had once feared that Damien's betrayal would define her daughter's life, but now she knew that Lyra's life would be shaped by something infinitely greater, the legacy of love, resilience, and freedom her mother had chosen to build. The following weeks brought with them waves of change. The story of the engagement party spread quickly across the city, every paper and column filled with accounts of Damien's disgrace and Ilara's triumph. Photographs of her standing in her midnight gown beside Ethan with Lyra clapping joyfully became symbols of a new era. Headlines spoke not of scandal, but victory, of a woman who had redefined strength. The Vance Reed Foundation launched with a fanfare that captured the hearts of many. Donations poured in, support flooded from across the nation, and within months, the estate that had once belonged to the Thornes was reborn. No longer a symbol of pride and arrogance, it became a haven for women and children who had been abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten. Illyra walked the halls of the newly restored mansion with Lyra, showing her that even the darkest places could be transformed into sanctuaries of hope. Eleanor Thorne visited one afternoon, her face lined with age and regret. She stood in the grand entryway, her eyes scanning the portraits of women and children who now graced the walls. When she looked at Illyra, her voice trembled. "I once believed you unworthy of our name, but I see now that our name was unworthy of you. You have created something greater than any legacy we could have given." Illyra accepted the words, not with pride, but with grace. She had no desire for vengeance. She only wanted acknowledgement that the future would not carry the same chains as the past. She guided Eleanor through the estate, showing her the classrooms, the gardens, and the dormitories filled with laughter. For the first time, Eleanor wept not from shame, but from hope. Damien, meanwhile, vanished into obscurity. His name was whispered only in pity, his presence erased from the places he once commanded. He was undone by his choices, a cautionary tale of squandered love and poisoned pride. Though Illyra no longer thought of him often, when she did, it was not with hatred. It was with the solemn understanding that some people could not be saved from themselves. She pitied him, but she no longer carried his shadow. Life with Ethan unfolded with a quiet beauty that contrasted the storms she had survived. They built routines filled with laughter and warmth, mornings spent in gentle conversation over coffee, evenings filled with Lyra's delighted squeals as Ethan chased her through the garden. Their love was not the firestorm of reckless passion she had once known. It was a steady flame that burned brighter with every act of trust, shared dream, and moment of tenderness. On their wedding day, the sun cast its light over a meadow filled with wildflowers. Illyra wore a radiant yet straightforward gown, her veil drifting like mist on a summer morning. Lyra scattered petals down the aisle, her laughter echoing through the air, while Clara stood proud, tears glistening in her eyes. Ethan waited at the altar, his gaze fixed on Illyra with reverence. When she reached him, their hands joined, and the vows they exchanged were not promises of perfection, but acknowledgments of truth. "I do not need you to complete me," Illyra said, her voice steady. "I am already whole, but I choose you to walk beside me and share my strength and scars." "And I choose you," Ethan replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "Not to own you, but to honor you. Not to save you, but to celebrate you. For as long as we both draw breath," when they sealed their vows with a kiss, the meadow erupted in applause, Lyra's laughter the brightest sound of all. In the years that followed, Illyra's legacy grew. The foundation expanded, touching lives far beyond Atlanta. Her designs became landmarks, symbols of innovation and resilience. Yet she never allowed fame to distance her from what mattered most. She was there for Lyra's first steps and words, and she was there for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, and every whispered dream. Ethan was there too, never overshadowing, always standing beside them, the steady rock upon which their family was built. As Lyra grew older, she began to understand the story of her mother's past, the betrayal, the pain, the triumph. Illyra did not shield her from the truth, but she framed it not as tragedy, but proof that even in the darkest times, one could rise. "We are not defined by what breaks us," she told her daughter one evening as they sat beneath the stars. "We are defined by how we rise after we fall." Lyra nodded, her eyes bright with admiration. "Then I will rise too, Mama, just like you." At that moment, Illyra knew her legacy was secure. It was not in the buildings she had designed, or the accolades she had received, but in the strength she had passed on to her daughter. On a quiet night years later, Illyra stood on the balcony of her home, Ethan beside her, Lyra asleep within. The city lights stretched before them, a glittering expanse that once symbolized her downfall, but now bore witness to her triumph. She leaned against Ethan, her heart full, her spirit free. "I thought revenge would be my victory," she said softly. "But I see now that true victory is freedom. The freedom to love, to forgive, to live without chains." Ethan kissed her temple, his arm wrapping around her. "And you are free, Elara. You always were. You only had to claim it." She smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon where dawn began to rise. It was the beginning of another day, another chapter, another chance to live fully. Her journey had not been easy, but it had been hers. And from the ruins of betrayal, she had built an enduring legacy of love, strength, and freedom that would echo through generations. Elara Vance was no longer just a survivor. She was a queen who had forged her crown from scars and carried it gracefully. And as the first light of morning touched her face, she knew with certainty that her story was not one of tragedy but of triumph.